Are hard to believe. Queens prosecutors accuse 74-year-old Ruchan Simbo of killing his 33-year-old wife, Salisha Ali,
The call came in just after sunrise. A 75-year-old man in New York stood in his home, voice steady, almost routine, as he told police his wife was missing. He said she hadn't come back. Said he didn't know where she went. Said he was worried. It was a regular Tuesday morning in Queens. Sanitation workers were making their rounds, picking up trash, moving block to block, nothing out of the ordinary. Until one of them noticed a smell. Not strong at first. Just enough to make him stop. Then it got worse. The kind of smell that doesn't belong on a quiet street, the kind that makes you look twice, then step back. And just like that, everything stopped. Sitting on the side of the road near Idlewild Park was a garbage bag. Tied, discarded, but heavier than it should have been. When it was opened, what was inside didn't make sense at first. A human torso. No head, no arms, no legs, just a body. Wrapped, abandoned, left there like it meant nothing. And thousands of miles away, in Trinidad, a mother had been waiting for her daughter to call back. Waiting for weeks, that turned into months. 4 months of silence, 4 months of unanswered calls. Not knowing that the answer had already been left on the side of a road in New York. Before we go further, take a second to subscribe to True Crime Stories Chronicles, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from around the world. Because what started as a simple missing person report was about to turn into something far more disturbing. Something that had been hidden, much closer than anyone imagined. Salisha Ali wasn't someone people described in extremes. She wasn't loud or attention-seeking. She was steady, focused, the kind of woman who carried responsibility quietly, without needing recognition for it. She was originally from Trinidad, where most of her life had been shaped by family, routine, and the realities of trying to build something stable in a place where opportunities didn't always come easily. And at the center of her world were her 3 daughters. Everything she did came back to them. Friends and family knew her as a devoted mother first, not just in words, but in action. She showed up, she provided, she worried, she planned. Her decisions weren't just about what she wanted, they were about what would give her children a better future than the one she felt limited by. And that kind of pressure changes how you see the world. It makes you more willing to take risks, more open to opportunities that promise stability, even if those opportunities come with uncertainty. Salisha wasn't naive. She understood struggle. But she also believed things could improve. That with the right move, the right support, the right chance, life could look different. That belief is what pushed her to think beyond Trinidad, to imagine something bigger, to consider starting over somewhere new. Salisha had tattoos of her daughters' names, not for style, not for attention, but as something permanent, something that stayed with her, no matter where she went, a reminder of who she was doing all of this for. Even when she left home, even when she stepped into a completely different life. Those names were still with her. And in the end, those same names would become one of the most important details in identifying her. But at this point in her life, none of that was part of the story yet. At this point, Salisha Ali was simply a mother trying to do better for her children. A woman willing to leave behind what she knew, in the hope of building something stronger somewhere else. And like so many others chasing that kind of change, she believed she was making the right decision. Salisha met the man who would later become her husband while he was visiting Trinidad. He was older, much older. At 75, he was more than twice her age. And from the outside, that alone raised questions. For her family, it wasn't something they could ignore. The difference in age wasn't just a number. It represented 2 completely different stages of life, different expectations, different levels of control. Her mother especially didn't feel comfortable with it. There was something about the situation that didn't sit right, even in the early stages. But Salisha saw it differently. When she spoke about him, she didn't frame the relationship around romance in the usual way. She focused on what he could provide: stability, support, a way out. She reportedly told her family that he was helping her, that this relationship could open doors for her and her children that she couldn't access on her own. And for someone carrying the weight of 3 children and the responsibility of building a future, that kind of support can feel like a solution. So despite the concerns, She moved forward. What followed was a major shift in her life. After marrying him, Salisha left Trinidad and relocated to New York. It wasn't just a change of location. It was a complete separation from everything familiar. Her family, her environment, her support system. All of it was now thousands of miles away. At first, it may have felt like progress. A new country, new opportunities, a chance to start over. But slowly, the dynamic in the relationship began to change. The same man who had offered support started to set limits. According to her mother, he began controlling aspects of her daily life. Where she could go, what she could do, the kind of independence she was allowed to have. These weren't loud, obvious actions at first. They were subtle but consistent, and over time they began to close in around her. Salisha wasn't someone who wanted to be confined. She had come to New York with a purpose: to work, to grow, to build something for herself and her children. But that independence didn't align with what her husband seemed to expect. He reportedly discouraged her from working, discouraged her from going out, and gradually her world became smaller. This is where the imbalance became clear. He was older, more established, and in a position of control, financially and physically. She was in a new country, without immediate support, trying to navigate a life that wasn't unfolding the way she had imagined. Still, she didn't completely give in to that control. There were signs she was pushing back, wanting to work, wanting to move freely, wanting to live the life she had envisioned when she first made the decision to leave Trinidad. But tension doesn't disappear when one person resists. It grows. And in situations like this, that resistance can shift the entire dynamic of a relationship. Sometimes quietly, sometimes all at once. Sometimes, the most dangerous relationships don't start with fear, they start with opportunity. Despite that, Salisha didn't stop trying to build something for herself. She hadn't come all the way to New York to sit still. She wanted structure, routine, a sense of purpose beyond the walls of the home she now shared with her husband. She wanted to work, and that desire created tension. Because while she was looking for independence, he seemed to be tightening control. According to what her family later shared, he didn't support the idea of her working or moving freely. He wanted her close, limited, dependent. But Salisha pushed back in her own way. She tried to establish a routine, tried to create some level of normalcy. Even small steps like wanting to go out or make plans became points of disagreement. And over time, those disagreements didn't fade. They built up. There's a kind of pressure that forms when two people want completely different things from the same situation. One trying to expand, the other trying to restrict. And when neither side gives in, that pressure has nowhere to go. It sits, it grows, until something shifts. To outsiders, nothing about her life looked immediately alarming. There were no loud public incidents, no obvious signs that something was about to happen. But beneath the surface, there was a clear imbalance that hadn't been resolved. Salisha was trying to move forward, but something was holding her back. Her communication with family continued, but there were moments that, in hindsight, would feel different. Small details that didn't stand out at the time. Conversations that seemed normal, but weren't entirely. Then came the final stretch of days. Nothing dramatic, no clear warning, no moment that signaled what was coming. Just a quiet shift. The kind that's easy to miss when you're living through it, but impossible to ignore once everything becomes clear. And then, something changed in the days leading up to her disappearance. The final 24 hours didn't begin with panic. They began like any other day. There was no loud argument anyone could point to, no urgent message asking for help, no clear signal that something was about to go wrong. At some point during that day, Salisha spoke with her family. It was a FaceTime call, the kind of call they had done before. Familiar, routine, a way to stay connected across distance. For her family back in Trinidad, those moments mattered. They were how they checked in, how they stayed involved in her life, even from far away. And on that call, nothing stood out in a way that triggered alarm. But there was something in the tone. Not something obvious, not something anyone could immediately define. Just a slight difference. The kind of thing that only becomes clear when you look back on it later. A pause that lasts a second too long. A response that feels slightly restrained. A moment where it seems like something is being held back. At the time, it didn't raise concern. It just passed. That's what makes moments like this so difficult to process afterward, because nothing felt urgent enough to act on. Nothing crossed the line into something clearly wrong. The call ended, with the assumption that there would be another one, but that next call never came. As the hours moved forward, there was no indication that anything had changed, no sudden alerts, no messages to suggest something had gone wrong. From her husband's perspective, life inside that home continued without interruption, but from the outside something was beginning to shift. The next day, Salisha didn't show up where she was expected to be. That alone was unusual. She was someone who had been trying to build structure into her life, trying to establish consistency. So when she didn't appear, it wasn't immediately brushed off as nothing. Still, there are moments when delays happen. Phones die, plans change, people get busy. So at first, there was patience. Then time passed. Calls were made, messages were sent, and there was no response. That silence didn't break. It stretched, from hours, into something longer. And with each attempt to reach her, the absence became harder to explain. For her family, the distance made everything worse. They couldn't just stop by, couldn't physically check on her. All they could do was call, wait, and hope for a reply that never came. At some point, concern began to take over. Because this wasn't like her. Not to go completely quiet, not to disappear without a word. And as that realization set in, the last conversation they had with her started to feel different. Every detail mattered now. Every word, every pause, every expression. They began to replay it in their minds, trying to find something they had missed. Something that could explain why she hadn't answered, why she hadn't reached out, why everything had suddenly stopped. But there were no clear answers. Just that final moment. That last time they saw her face, heard her voice, spoke to her as if nothing was about to change. And without realizing it at the time, that moment had already become something else entirely. That was the last time anyone heard her voice. The next morning, the silence turned into something harder to ignore. Salisha didn't show up to work. At first, it might have seemed like a simple delay. But as time passed, that explanation stopped making sense. This wasn't someone who disappeared without a word. She had been trying to build consistency, to create some structure for herself. Not showing up, and not calling, was out of character. Attempts to reach her continued. Calls went unanswered, messages stayed unread, and with each passing hour, the concern began to grow into something heavier. Back in Trinidad, her family felt it first. That instinct that something wasn't right. They had been in contact with her just a day before. There was no reason for her to suddenly go quiet, no explanation that fit the way she lived her life. So they started asking questions. They reached out again and again. Still nothing. Eventually, attention turned to the one person who was physically closest to her. The man she lived with. The man who had last seen her. When asked where Salisha was, his answers didn't bring clarity. He said she had left. Said she walked out. Said he didn't know where she went. And then came the detail that raised even more questions. He claimed he couldn't reach her either. That she wasn't answering his calls. That he was also trying to figure out where she was. But something about it didn't sit right. If she had simply left, where would she go without contacting anyone? Why wouldn't she reach out to her children? Why cut off communication completely, with everyone, at the same time? The explanation didn't match the person they knew. And yet there wasn't enough in that moment to immediately prove otherwise. So the uncertainty remained. Days passed, and the situation didn't improve. No updates, no contact. The silence stayed in place, and with it came a growing sense that this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was something else. For her family, the distance made everything more difficult. Every question had to go through someone else. Every answer depended on what they were being told. And the one person closest to her, the one who should have had the most clarity, only offered vague explanations. At this point, what would you have done? Does his story sound believable to you? Then in September, everything shifted. Sanitation workers in Queens were going about a routine task when they came across something unusual. A garbage bag, out of place, heavier than expected. At first, it didn't seem like anything more than discarded waste, until it was opened. Inside was a human torso, wrapped, bound, already in a state of decomposition. The discovery immediately changed the direction of the case. This was no longer about a missing person who might still be found alive. This was something else entirely. Authorities moved quickly to secure the area, but at that moment, there was still one major question. Who was this? There were no immediate answers. No face to identify. No clear way to connect the remains to a name. Just a body, hidden, discarded, and left in a place where someone hoped it wouldn't be found. But even in that condition, there were details that stood out. Markings, ink, tattoos. And those details began to tell a story. Because etched into her skin were names. Those names weren't random, they were her daughters. That realization changed everything. What had been an unidentified body was now becoming someone. A mother. A woman who had been reported missing just weeks earlier. Salisha Ali. The discovery didn't just confirm that she was gone, it revealed the level of violence involved. This wasn't a sudden incident. This was something that had been done deliberately. Her body had been handled, concealed, and left in a way that suggested an attempt to hide what had happened. For her family, the moment of identification brought a different kind of pain. Not just the loss, but the way it happened. The confirmation that while they were searching, while they were hoping, she had already been gone. And the image of those tattoos, the names she carried for her daughters, became one of the most powerful and heartbreaking parts of the entire case. If this was Salisha, then who had done this? And more importantly, who had been closest to her when she disappeared? Investigators began with the most obvious place, her home. The same place where her husband had reported her missing. The same place where he claimed she had simply walked out and disappeared. But now, that explanation had to be tested against evidence, not just words. Inside the home, small details started to stand out. Items that didn't seem unusual at first, but took on new meaning in light of what had been found. Materials that matched the way the body had been handled. Rope, plastic. Objects that, on their own, might not raise concern, but together they formed a pattern that couldn't be ignored. The space itself told a quiet story. Because this wasn't random. Attention turned fully toward her husband, the same man who had said she left, the same man who claimed he didn't know where she was. At this point, his statements weren't enough. They needed to be measured against movement, timing, and location. So investigators began tracking his activity. Phone records became critical. Not just calls or messages, but location patterns. Where he had been, when he had been there. How those movements aligned with the timeline of her disappearance, and what they found began to fill in the gaps. His phone placed him in areas that matched where the remains had been discovered. Not once, more than once. Locations that had no clear connection to his daily routine, no obvious reason for him to be there, except for what had already been found in those exact places. That changed the direction of the case. From there, the timeline started to come together. The last known contact with Salisha. The period where she went silent. The moments where his movements placed him near the disposal sites. Each piece lined up in a way that pointed toward one conclusion. This wasn't a situation where someone disappeared and was later found. This was a sequence of actions, a progression, one step leading to the next, and as that progression became clearer, so did the gap between his version of events and what actually happened. Because if she had simply left, there would be no reason for him to be in those locations. If he didn't know where she was, there would be no connection between his movements and the places where her body was found. But the evidence didn't support that. It pointed in the opposite direction. And that's where the case shifted from suspicion to something more concrete. The narrative he had given, simple, direct, almost casual, began to break apart under scrutiny. Not all at once, but piece by piece. Until what remained was something far more serious. This wasn't confusion, this wasn't coincidence. This was intention. Because every step, every movement, every decision that followed her disappearance showed a level of awareness that couldn't be explained away. He didn't just lie, he calculated. And once that realization took hold, the investigation moved forward with a clear focus. The person who reported her missing was now at the center of everything. Once investigators established the timeline and his movements, the full picture of what happened to Salisha began to come into focus. And it was far more disturbing than anyone had initially imagined. This wasn't a single act followed by panic. It was followed by a series of deliberate steps meant to hide what had been done. After Salisha was killed, her body was not left in one place. It was separated, handled in a way that suggested time had been taken, time to move, to conceal, to decide how to prevent immediate discovery. The remains weren't discarded all at once. They were placed in different locations, at different times, creating distance between each part. That decision mattered, because it slowed everything down. It delayed identification. It made it harder to connect the remains back to one person. It turned what could have been a faster investigation into something that unfolded in stages. The first discovery, the torso, didn't tell the whole story. It raised questions, but it didn't immediately reveal the scale of what had happened. It wasn't until later, when additional remains were found in another location, that the full extent became clear. Each discovery added another piece, another confirmation that this wasn't random or rushed. It was intentional, and the locations themselves weren't chosen by accident. They were places where someone could move without drawing attention, places where something could be left behind without immediate notice, areas that created space between the crime and the discovery. All of it pointed to one goal: time. Time before anyone realized what had happened. Time before the remains were connected. Time before suspicion fully settled in the right place. But even with those efforts, there were details that couldn't be erased. The tattoos, the timeline, the movement patterns, those elements remained, and they brought everything back together. For Salisha's family, understanding what had been done to her came with a different kind of pain. It wasn't just the loss, it was the way it was carried out. The realization that while they were searching, hoping for contact, she had already been gone and hidden. The truth, once fully revealed, didn't come all at once. It came in pieces. For Salisha's family, the truth didn't come as a single moment. It came as a weight that settled in and refused to lift. Her mother had sensed something was wrong long before any of this happened. The relationship, the move, the distance, it never felt right to her. And now, that feeling had turned into something she couldn't undo. I warned her. Those words carry a different meaning after loss. They don't bring comfort. They don't change the outcome. They just sit there, heavy, unresolved. Because warnings don't always sound urgent when life is still moving forward. And by the time they make sense, it's often too late. Grief, in this case, wasn't just sadness, it was shock. The kind that makes it hard to process what actually happened. One moment, they were trying to reach her, calling, waiting, hoping. The next, they were being told she wasn't coming back. For her mother, there was also the distance, not being there, not being able to step in, not being able to protect her in the way she would have if she were closer. That kind of helplessness doesn't fade easily. And then there were her children. 3 daughters. The same daughters whose names she carried with her, now left without their mother. They didn't just lose her. They lost the person who made every decision with them in mind. The one who was trying to build something better for them. And now, they're left to grow up with questions that don't have simple answers. Why did this happen? Why didn't she leave sooner? There are stories that stay with you because of what happened, and then there are stories that stay with you because of what they reveal. This is one of those stories. Because when you look closely, the signs weren't hidden, they were just easy to overlook. Control is often misunderstood. It doesn't always show up as something obvious. It can look like concern, like protection, like someone wanting to keep you close. But when that control starts limiting your freedom, where you go, what you do, who you speak to, that's no longer care, that's restriction. And over time, restriction can turn into something far more dangerous. Isolation plays a role too. When someone is removed from their support system, family, friends, familiar surroundings, it becomes harder to recognize when something is wrong. Harder to ask for help, harder to leave. Distance creates silence, and silence creates vulnerability. Financial dependence adds another layer. When one person controls the resources, it shifts the balance of power. Decisions become limited, options become fewer, and leaving becomes more complicated than it should be. That's why independence matters, not just financially, but emotionally, socially, mentally. And then there's intuition. Family members often see things from the outside that the person inside the situation might not fully recognize. Not because they're unaware, but because they're trying to make things work. Trying to justify. Trying to hold on to what they hoped the situation would be. But intuition exists for a reason. If something feels off consistently, not just once, it deserves attention. And finally, disappearance. When someone suddenly goes silent, completely silent, it should never be dismissed. Especially when it's out of character. Especially when it involves a parent. That kind of silence isn't normal, and it shouldn't be treated as something that can wait. So ask yourself this. If someone you knew stopped responding today, no calls, no messages, how quickly would you act? Would you wait? Or would you push for answers immediately? At the beginning of this story, there was a man standing in his home, calmly reporting his wife missing. He said she left. He said he didn't know where she was. But the truth was already there, hidden behind those words, waiting to be uncovered. Salisha Ali didn't disappear. She was taken from her life, from her children, from everything she was trying to build. And what makes this story even harder to process is that it didn't start with violence. It started with trust. It started with the belief that things would get better. And somewhere along the way, that belief turned into something she couldn't escape. If this story stayed with you, make sure you like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell me, do you think this could have been prevented?